A city built on mud, forced to drive wooden piles through 10 meters of soggy ground just to stand upright, Amsterdam had no choice but to slice its land into strips just 5 or 6 meters wide. That is why the Dutch built those famously narrow houses, and it worked so well that the city's golden age exploded on the thinnest foundations in Europe. But squeezing greatness out of soggy soil took more than tax tricks. What secret did this system hold, and why did it outsmart every other city? Beneath Amsterdam's neat rows of houses lies a puzzle of mud, water, and wood. The city sits on a patchwork of peat and clay, sometimes more than 10 meters deep before you hit anything solid. This soft, spongy ground refuses to support heavy buildings on its own. Early builders learned the hard way: anything too big or too wide would slowly sink, tilt, or even break apart. The only way to keep a house standing was to drive long wooden piles, straight tree trunks, down through the muck until they reached the firmer sand below. For a single house, that meant dozens of piles, each stretching 12 to 20 meters long. Each extra meter of width demanded more piles, more timber, and more labor. The cost did not just add up, it multiplied. Wider buildings needed not only more piles, but also heavier beams and extra bracing to keep everything stable. All of this had to be done by hand, with teams of workers hammering each pile deep into the earth. The wood itself had to stay underwater to avoid rot, relying on the city's high water table to keep out oxygen and preserve the timber for centuries. On paper, you could build as wide as you liked. In reality, the ground punished ambition. Every added meter of frontage meant a jump in expense and risk. In a city where mud was the rule, not the exception, narrow footprints were not just a style, they were a survival strategy. In 1609, Amsterdam's city leaders faced a problem that could not be solved by piling up more timber or digging deeper into the mud. The city was booming, but space inside the medieval walls was running out. Instead of letting houses sprawl wherever they fit, planners made a bold decision to reshape the city with a new organized plan. Over the next 5 decades, workers dug 3 sweeping rings of canals: Herengracht, Keizersgracht, and Prinsengracht, tracing elegant arcs around the old center. These were not just pretty waterways. They were the main arteries of commerce, the lifelines for trade. Every meter of canal edge was as valuable as gold. To make the most of that value, the city divided the newly drained land into a series of narrow plots, each just 5 to 7 meters wide along the water. On a map from the era, these lots look like long, thin fingers stretching away from the canal. The logic was simple: the more slices, the more merchants could claim a front door right on the water. Instead of a handful of grand estates, Amsterdam got rows of tightly packed houses, each with its own stake in the city's trading network. Once these plots were sold, the pattern was set. Anyone buying property on the new canals inherited a skinny rectangle, locked in by the planner's geometry. The question was not how wide to build, but how to make the most of a narrow slice. The city's distinctive skyline, tall, slender houses standing shoulder to shoulder, was not the result of fashion or a passing trend. It was a deliberate answer to the challenge of sharing limited high-value land in a city built for trade. The story that Dutch houses are narrow because of a clever tax dodge has a certain appeal, but the evidence tells a different story. When Amsterdam's Canal district was carved up in the early 1600s, the city had already locked in those skinny plots, 5 to 7 meters wide, stretching deep into the block. The famous taxes on facade width came later, after the city's planners had already sliced the land. Fees and levies on street frontage made it even less tempting to expand sideways, but they were not the reason most houses started out narrow. They simply kept owners from breaking the mold. The real-world exceptions prove the point. Along the Herengracht's Golden Bend, the richest merchants did not settle for a single slice. They bought up 2 or 3 plots, combining them into wide palatial homes that announced their wealth to the city. These grand houses did not worry about extra taxes. They could afford the prestige. For everyone else, the message was clear. Width was a luxury, not a loophole. The average merchant worked within the limits set by the city's original plan, not just by the taxman's ledger. Narrow houses were not born from tax trickery. They were a practical response, reinforced by later rules, but never truly caused by them. Step inside a classic Amsterdam canal house, and the first thing that hits you is how every centimeter is put to work. The ground floor, facing the water, was the business end, a shop, a trading room, or a merchant's office, always ready for customers or shipments arriving by boat. Just beyond, the hallway stretches deep into the lot, growing narrower as you go, with rooms tucked wherever space allows. Then come the stairs, steep, winding, and so tight they are almost vertical. Carrying a chair up these steps is a challenge. A piano is out of the question. That is why, high above the street, nearly every house sports a wooden beam jutting from the gable. That beam is the hoist beam, a simple but brilliant solution. With a rope and pulley, heavy barrels, crates, and even entire pieces of furniture could be lifted straight up from the street and swung through the big upper windows. In the attic, goods and supplies were stored, safe and dry above the bustle below. Living quarters, kitchens, bedrooms, and sitting rooms were stacked one on top of the other, each floor a slice of life in a vertical world. What looks compact from the outside unfolds into a clever maze inside, built for both commerce and comfort, shaped by the need to make every bit of the narrow plot count. Amsterdam's narrow house system wasn't just a clever way to save space. It was an urban engine that delivered real wins across the board. First, the city's planners turned canal frontage into a shared resource. Slicing the land into slim plots let dozens of merchants line the water, each with a direct link to the trade network. Instead of a handful of mansions, the city got rows of businesses, shops, and workshops all plugged into the supply chain. Goods could arrive by boat, be hoisted straight from the water into upper floors, and stored or processed just meters from the dock. This minimized street congestion and kept the city's economic heart beating with efficiency. The design also shaped daily life. Mixed neighborhoods sprang up, with families, traders, and craftsmen living and working side by side. The vertical layout meant home and business were a staircase above, not a commute away. Structurally, these lighter, narrow buildings handled the city's soft ground better than sprawling blocks. If a house settled or leaned, it could do so without dragging its neighbors down. Instead of fighting the mud, the city adapted, turning constraint into advantage and building a system that thrived on being tall, deep, and just a few meters wide. The logic behind Amsterdam's narrow houses isn't just a relic of the past, it's still shaping the city today. Walk along the canals and you will find 17th century trading rooms turned into design studios, law offices, and boutique hotels. Attics that once held spices and grain now serve as loft apartments or archives. Even the steep stairs and hoist beams remain part of daily life. Residents still use those old beams to lift furniture through upper windows, skipping the impossible climb inside. But keeping these buildings upright is a modern engineering challenge. The original wooden piles, some driven more than 12 meters into the ground, can last for centuries if they stay underwater. When water tables drop or piles rot, engineers step in. Teams might underpin a house with concrete supports or carefully replace failing piles while people still live and work above. This kind of work is delicate, expensive, and ongoing. Some of the city's narrowest houses have found new fame. On Oude Hoogstraat, a house just over 2 meters wide now draws tourists as the smallest tea room in Amsterdam. Inside, a tiny shop and a museum fill the space once meant for one family. 400 years after the first piles went in, these slender houses are still solving problems, adapting to new needs, and holding their ground, literally and figuratively, on the edge of the water. In cities everywhere, space is running out. The Dutch solution still holds. When land is scarce, we're forced to rethink what enough room truly means. Today, those narrow houses aren't just history, they're a blueprint for living well, even when the world squeezes tighter. What would you build?